Christopher Hayes was running late again. His heart raced as he glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 8:15 a.m. Ethan's tiny voice piped up from the back seat. "Daddy, we're gonna be late." The 4-year-old clutched his favorite stuffed dinosaur, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his dad's head. Christopher tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He'd barely slept last night, juggling spreadsheets and investor calls while trying not to wake Ethan. Now, with an important board meeting looming, every second felt like torture. The daycare sign loomed ahead, bright letters spelling out Bright Futures Daycare. Christopher didn't think twice. He pulled into the parking lot, kissed Ethan on the forehead, and rushed him inside. "Be good, buddy," he muttered before bolting out the door. It wasn't until he was halfway through his presentation that it hit him. His stomach dropped. Cold sweat prickled his skin. Bright Futures? That wasn't Ethan's daycare. They went to Elite Childcare Center, a sleek, expensive facility blocks away. Panic surged through him. What had he done? Who were these people? And what would they think of a millionaire tech CEO who couldn't even drop his kid off at the right place? By the time Christopher reached for his phone to call the daycare, his mind was spinning with worst-case scenarios. Had someone called child services? Was Ethan scared and crying? Or worse, what if no one noticed? He never expected what came next. Christopher's phone buzzed in his hand. One missed call. No voicemail. His chest tightened. What were they waiting for? Why hadn't anyone called him back? When he finally reached the daycare, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely dial the number. A warm voice answered on the second ring. "Bright Futures Daycare. This is Sarah." "Hi." Christopher stammered, gripping the edge of the conference table. "I think I dropped my son off there by mistake this morning. Ethan Hayes." There was a pause. Then Sarah said gently, "Oh yes, Ethan's here. He's doing just fine." Christopher exhaled sharply, but his relief was short-lived. "Is he okay? Did he cry? I can come get him right now." "No need to rush," Sarah interrupted, her tone calm and reassuring. "He was a little shy at first, but he's settling in nicely. We're happy to have him for the day if you'd like." Christopher blinked, stunned. Shy? Settling in? That didn't sound like his Ethan. Normally, Ethan clung to him like glue, refusing to let go even at their usual daycare. "I'll be there as soon as I can," he said quickly, guilt twisting in his gut. 2 hours later, Christopher burst through the doors of Bright Futures, tie askew and hair disheveled. The space was nothing like Elite Childcare Center. No marble floors or designer furniture. Instead, colorful murals covered the walls, and the air smelled faintly of crayons and peanut butter. Then he saw them. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor with 3 other kids, laughing as Sarah helped them build a tower out of blocks. His son's face lit up in a way Christopher hadn't seen in months. Sarah noticed him first. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, and offered a small smile. "You must be Christopher." He nodded, still staring at Ethan. "Thank you for taking care of him. I'm so sorry about the mix-up." "It's no trouble at all," she said softly. "Kids are resilient. Sometimes they just need a little extra love." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Extra love. Something he hadn't been able to give Ethan lately, not with work swallowing every spare moment. As Sarah knelt beside Ethan to say goodbye, Christopher realized something else. This daycare wasn't what he expected, and neither was she. Christopher couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's words. Sometimes they just need a little extra love. They haunted him all the way home. What did that even mean? Was he failing as a father? That night, Christopher tucked Ethan into bed like always, but something felt different. His son chattered excitedly about his day, how Sarah had taught them a song about dinosaurs, how he'd made 2 new friends, and how they'd eaten the best mac and cheese ever. It was the most animated Christopher had seen Ethan in months. But as Ethan drifted off to sleep, Christopher sank onto the couch, guilt pressing down on him like a weight. He thought back to the days after his wife, Claire, passed away 2 years ago. Back then, he promised himself he'd do everything right for Ethan, to give him the life Claire would have wanted. Instead, he'd buried himself in work, Sure, he provided Ethan with everything money could buy. Private schools, fancy clothes, and endless gadgets. But when was the last time they'd spent more than 10 minutes together without distractions? The next morning, Christopher found himself driving back to Bright Futures. Not because of Ethan, but because of Sarah. When she greeted him, her smile was warm but cautious. Back so soon. I wanted to thank you again, he said awkwardly. And maybe ask some questions. About what? About Ethan. About this place. He gestured around the cozy room. How do you get kids to open up like that? To feel happy? Sarah tilted her head, studying him. It's not magic, if that's what you're asking. It's about listening, being present. Kids can tell when you're really there, or when your mind is somewhere else. Her words stung, but they also intrigued him. Over the next few weeks, Christopher visited Bright friends often, using flimsy excuses to see how Sarah worked her magic. Each visit revealed more about her, and about himself. Sarah wasn't just kind. She was tough. She ran Bright Futures on a shoestring budget, fighting tooth and nail to keep it open while wealthier centers like Elite Childcare thrived. Her own past losses, a failed marriage, dreams deferred, had shaped her into someone who poured her heart into helping others. Meanwhile, Christopher struggled to reconcile his polished corporate image with the raw emotions bubbling inside him. At one point, Sarah caught him staring at a mural of children holding hands. You look lost, she said bluntly. I am, he admitted. I thought I was giving Ethan the best life possible. But now I'm not so sure. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. Instead, she handed him a cup of coffee and said, maybe it's not about what you give him. Maybe it's about what you share with him. Those words stuck with Christopher long after he left. Christopher's phone buzzed on his desk. It was a text from his assistant. Board meeting in 10 minutes. Don't be late. But Christopher barely noticed. His mind was still stuck on Sarah's words. What you share with him. What did that even mean for a man like him? The board meeting started off tense. Investors were circling like sharks, ready to pounce on any weakness. The company's latest product launch had flopped, and whispers of a hostile takeover filled the room. Christopher tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Bright Futures, to Sarah's calm confidence, her ability to connect with kids who felt invisible. Then it hit him. What if his business problems weren't so different from his parenting ones? He'd been trying to force success through sheer willpower, just like he tried to buy Ethan's happiness with expensive toys and private lessons. Maybe what both needed wasn't more control, it was connection. As the meeting dragged on, Christopher found himself sketching ideas in the margins of his notebook. What if they stopped competing with bigger companies and started collaborating instead? What if their products focused less on flashy features and more on solving real problems for real people? By the time the meeting ended, Christopher had a plan, and an unlikely source of inspiration. That evening, he drove straight to Bright Futures. Sarah looked surprised to see him again. You're here late, she said, raising an eyebrow. I need your help, he blurted out. Her eyes widened. My help? With what? Everything. He hesitated, then plunged ahead. Your teaching methods, they're amazing. How you make kids feel seen and valued. I think I can use that same approach to save my company. For once, Sarah didn't have a quick answer. She studied him carefully before nodding slowly. Okay, tell me more. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. Christopher began implementing changes inspired by Sarah's philosophy. Employees were encouraged to collaborate rather than compete. Products were redesigned to prioritize user experience over profit margins. Even the office culture shifted. Meetings became less formal, coffee breaks turned into brainstorming sessions, and everyone seemed happier. But the biggest change happened at home. One Saturday morning, Christopher woke up early and decided to take Ethan to the park. Not because he felt guilty, but because he genuinely wanted to spend time together. For hours, they laughed, chased ducks, and talked about dinosaurs. When Ethan hugged him tightly afterward, Christopher realized something. This was worth more than any amount of money. Meanwhile, Sarah faced challenges of her own. Despite her best efforts, Bright Futures was struggling financially. One afternoon, she confided in Christopher during one of their brainstorming sessions. "I might have to close down," she admitted quietly. "I've done everything I can." But Christopher cut her off. "No, you won't." The next day, he called a press conference, not to announce new products, but to highlight Bright Futures. Using his influence, he shared Sarah's story with the world, emphasizing the importance of affordable, high-quality childcare. Within days, donations poured in, and local businesses offered support. When Sarah saw the news coverage, tears streamed down her face. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked later. "Because you reminded me what really matters," Christopher replied simply. The boardroom was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Christopher stood at the head of the table, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. The hostile takeover attempt had reached its peak. The investors on the other side of the table were relentless, throwing numbers and threats like weapons. They wanted control, plain and simple. And Christopher? He'd been backed into a corner. But this time he wasn't afraid. Instead of fighting fire with fire, he leaned back in his chair, calm and steady. "You're right," he said finally, breaking the tension. "Our old model isn't working anymore. We've been chasing profits instead of purpose. But we can fix that." He clicked a button, and a slideshow appeared on the screen behind him. It wasn't filled with graphs or financial projections, it was pictures. Pictures of employees collaborating, customers smiling, and yes, even kids from Bright Futures laughing together. "This is our future," Christopher continued. "We're shifting focus to partnerships, not competition. To building communities, not just products. And if you don't want to be part of that," he shrugged, "then maybe we're better off without you." For a moment, no one spoke. Then one investor leaned forward, intrigued. "How do you plan to make this work?" Christopher smiled. "By doing what I should have done years ago, listening, learning, connecting." By the end of the meeting, the tide had turned. Some investors walked away, but others stayed, inspired by Christopher's vision. For the first time in months, he felt hope, not just for his company, but for himself. That night, he went home exhausted but exhilarated. Ethan greeted him at the door with a crayon drawing. "It's us," he announced proudly, pointing to stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Christopher hugged him tightly, realizing how much he'd almost lost. A few days later, another storm hit, but this one came from within the family. Claire's parents arrived unannounced, their faces grim. "You're failing Ethan," his mother-in-law said bluntly. "He needs stability, not some daycare run by strangers." Christopher bristled, ready to defend himself, but Sarah stepped in unexpectedly. She'd come over to drop off some paperwork and heard the argument unfolding. "With all due respect," she said firmly, "Ethan is thriving. He's happier, more confident, and learning skills that will last a lifetime. If that's failure, then I don't know what success looks like." Claire's parents stared at her, shocked into silence. Finally, Claire's father sighed. "Maybe we've been too hard on you, Chris. We just miss her too." Tears welled up in Christopher's eyes as he nodded. "I miss her every day, but I'm trying to honor her memory by being the best dad I can be for Ethan." 6 months later, Bright Futures Daycare looked nothing like it used to. The once faded murals were now vibrant, the classrooms buzzing with laughter and energy. And standing in the middle of it all was Sarah, watching as Ethan ran up to her with a handful of dandelions. "Look what I found," Ethan said proudly, thrusting the flowers toward her. Sarah laughed, crouching down to his level. "Those are perfect. Thank you, buddy." Behind them, Christopher watched, his chest swelling with pride. What had started as a simple mistake, a wrong turn on a chaotic morning, had transformed both their lives in ways he never could have imagined. Bright Futures wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Thanks to the media attention sparked by Christopher's press conference, donations had poured in from across the country. Local businesses offered free supplies, volunteers came forward to help renovate the space, and enrollment skyrocketed. Parents who'd once dismissed the modest daycare now fought for spots on the waiting list. For Christopher, the changes went deeper than business success or community impact. He'd restructured his company around collaboration and purpose, earning back the trust of employees and investors alike. Profits weren't as high as they used to be, but morale was through the roof. Employees stayed late not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Customers felt valued, not exploited. At home, things were different too. Christopher no longer worked late nights or missed bedtime stories. Instead, he made time for puzzles, park visits, and even cooking disasters in the kitchen with Ethan. They weren't perfect moments. They were messy, chaotic, and sometimes exhausting, but they were real. One evening, as they sat together building a Lego tower, Ethan looked up at him. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Christopher froze, his throat tightening. Then he smiled softly. "Yeah, buddy. I think she'd be really proud." The partnership between Christopher and Sarah grew stronger as well. Though their worlds couldn't have been more different, they complemented each other perfectly. She taught him patience and empathy. He helped her dream bigger than she ever thought possible. Together, they became advocates for work-life balance policies, speaking at conferences and pushing for change in industries far beyond tech. As Sarah locked up bright futures one evening, Christopher waited outside, leaning against his car. "You know," he said when she approached, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For reminding me what really matters." She smiled, shaking her head. "You did that yourself, Chris. I just gave you a nudge." But they both knew it was more than that. Sometimes, life gives you exactly what you need, even if it comes wrapped in an unexpected package. Have you ever stopped to wonder how one small decision can change everything? For Christopher Hayes, it started with a wrong turn. For Ethan, it began with a stranger's kindness. And for Sarah Thompson, it was about believing in something bigger than herself. Looking back, Christopher realized the universe had been nudging him all along. That chaotic morning, the mix-up at daycare, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a gift, a chance to see his life from a new perspective, to understand that success isn't measured by wealth or power but by connection and love. Ethan blossomed into a confident, curious child who loved school, made friends easily, and still carried his stuffed dinosaur everywhere for good luck. Bright futures became a beacon of hope in their community, proving that even small acts of kindness could create ripples far beyond what anyone imagined. And Christopher? He learned that being a good father and a good man meant showing up, not just physically but emotionally. It meant listening when people spoke, sharing joy instead of chasing perfection, and trusting that doing the right thing would always lead to something better. As he tucked Ethan into bed one night, his son looked up at him sleepily. "Daddy?" "Yeah, buddy? I'm glad we went to the wrong place that day." Christopher chuckled, brushing a strand of hair off Ethan's forehead. "Me too, kiddo. Me too. So, where does that leave us? Maybe you're reading this during a tough time, wondering if things will ever get better. Or maybe you're cruising through life, feeling like nothing exciting ever happens to you. Either way, remember this. Sometimes the wrong turns lead to the best destinations. What small act of kindness could change your life or someone else's forever?